I spent 35 years believing I was the problem, the daughter who wasn't lovable enough, the child who had to earn every scrap of affection while my sister Lily received everything freely. I told myself it was normal. I told myself all families had favorites. Then my parents skipped my wedding for Lily's beach trip, and I finally stopped making excuses. 2 years of silence followed. 2 years of healing. 2 years of learning that my worth wasn't measured by their approval. Then the phone rang. My mother's voice was honey sweet, the tone she only used when she wanted something. Lily's getting married. We need $50,000. You're the only one who can help. I stood in my kitchen, knuckles white against the counter, and felt that old familiar pull, the desperate need to finally be enough. I was about to say yes. Then my Aunt Margaret grabbed my wrist at Lily's engagement party, her fingers ice cold and trembling. Come with me. Now. Don't let them see us leave. She showed me a document dated 1991, and everything I believed about my family, about myself, shattered in an instant. Have you ever discovered that your entire life was built on a lie? My name is Taryn McCarthy. I'm 35 years old, and I work as Director of Financial Operations at a regional investment firm in Columbus, Ohio. On paper, my life looks like a success story, but behind every achievement, there's a girl who spent her whole childhood trying to be worthy of love that was never freely given. I grew up being told I was special. We chose you, my mother Diane would say whenever I asked why things were different for me than for my younger sister Lily. Not every child gets to be chosen. But even as a little girl, I noticed that being chosen came with conditions. I was expected to be grateful for everything, to never complain, to understand when money was tight and sacrifices had to be made. Meanwhile, Lily received things I never even knew to ask for: a college fund that appeared when she turned 18, a car for her 16th birthday, a deposit for her first apartment. When I once gathered the courage to ask my mother why Lily got things I never did, she looked at me with something between pity and irritation. Lily is different, Taryn. You understand. I learned to stop asking. I told myself it was because I was adopted, that maybe deep down they regretted taking me in. I imagined my birth mother was probably a scared teenager who had no choice but to give me up. I never searched for her because my parents told me the records were sealed, that there was nothing to find. I believed them. I always believed them. But there were moments that haunted me. When I was 14, I found a photograph hidden in a box in the attic. A woman I had never seen before holding a baby. She had my exact eyes, my exact smile. Something in my chest tightened when I looked at her. I brought the photo downstairs and asked my mother who she was. Diane's face went white. She snatched the photograph from my hand so fast she nearly tore it. That's no one. Someone from before. Don't go through old boxes, Taryn. The photo disappeared. I never saw it again. Another time, years later, I overheard my father, Richard, on the phone in his study. His voice was low and urgent. She can never know about Eleanor. It would ruin everything. Eleanor, I assumed it was my birth mother's name. I searched online for years trying different combinations, but without a last name or a location, I found nothing. Eventually, I stopped looking. Some doors I decided were meant to stay closed. Then, 6 months before my wedding, a woman named Margaret appeared at a family gathering. I had never seen her before in my life. My parents were visibly uncomfortable the moment she walked in. She introduced herself as a distant relative from my mother's side, but she looked at me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. She asked strange questions. Are you happy? Do they treat you well? Do you know where you come from? Before I could answer, my mother pulled her away. I overheard them arguing in the kitchen. You have no right to be here. We had an agreement. Margaret's response was too quiet to catch. After that day, Margaret called me several times asking to meet. I agreed once, driven by curiosity I couldn't explain. She was nervous, starting sentences and stopping. Finally, she said, there are things you deserve to know, but I need to find the right way. I need to find some documents first. Please be patient. Then she told me she was sick. Cancer. Terminal. Before I could ask anything more, my mother called demanding I come home. Margaret and I didn't speak again for months, and then came my wedding day. The day my parents chose a beach vacation with Lily over watching me marry the love of my life. Only 12 people attended my ceremony. Marcus's family filled one side. My side had only Margaret, who had flown in from Oregon despite her illness. After the ceremony, she hugged me and whispered something I didn't understand then. She would be so proud of you. I didn't know who she meant, but I was about to find out. For 2 years after my wedding, I built a wall between myself and my parents. Not a dramatic confrontation, not a formal estrangement, just distance. I stopped calling every Sunday. I stopped attending holiday dinners where I would sit in the corner while everyone fussed over Lily. I focused on my marriage, my career, my own life. Marcus and I bought a house together. I got promoted twice. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was living for myself instead of constantly trying to prove my worth to people who would never see it. I thought I had finally found peace. I thought the hardest part was behind me. I was wrong. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March. I was making dinner when my phone buzzed with a name I hadn't seen in months. Mom. My finger hovered over the screen for a long moment before I answered. My mother's voice was honey sweet, the tone she reserved exclusively for when she wanted something. Taryn, sweetheart, it's so good to hear your voice. We miss you so much. Family should be together, don't you think? I waited. I had learned long ago that my mother's sweetness always came with a price tag. I'm calling with wonderful news, she continued. Your sister is engaged to Bradley Harrison III. You know the Harrisons, of course. Very prominent family here in Columbus, very respected. I offered my congratulations, keeping my voice neutral. The wedding is in 3 weeks, my mother said, and we need your help, Taryn. The Harrisons have certain expectations. The wedding needs to be appropriate to their standards. We've calculated the costs and we're short. We need $50,000. As the number hung in the air between us, $50,000, more than I had spent on my entire wedding, the one they couldn't be bothered to attend. You're the only one in the family who has that kind of money, my mother continued. You know we wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. This is Lily's future we're talking about, her one chance at a really good life. The unspoken message was clear. Refuse and I would be the ungrateful adopted daughter who destroyed her sister's chance at happiness. I told her I needed to think about it. She sighed heavily as if my hesitation was a personal betrayal. My father called the next day with the sharper version of the same request. After everything we did for you, Taryn, taking you in when you had no one, raising you, giving you a home when you had nothing, this is how you can finally repay us. Finally, as if 35 years of trying to earn their love had meant nothing. As if every sacrifice, every swallowed hurt, every moment I'd spent being the good daughter counted for nothing at all. But he wasn't finished. We'll need you to come to dinner next week. He added, his tone shifting to something almost casual. Before the wedding, there's some paperwork we need to go over, just some family financial planning. You're good with that stuff. He didn't elaborate. I didn't ask. I was too busy processing the $50,000 demand. But something about his tone made me uneasy. It sounded rehearsed, like he was reading from a script he had practiced. When I told Marcus about the calls that night, his reaction was immediate. What paperwork? Why would they need you to sign anything? These are the same people who chose a beach vacation over our wedding, Taryn. You don't owe them a single cent. He was right. I knew he was right. But 35 years of conditioning doesn't dissolve with logic. The guilt was so deeply wired into me that I couldn't separate my own thoughts from the voice in my head that still whispered, I wasn't grateful enough, I wasn't good enough. I owed them everything for simply existing. A few days later, Lily called. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up, and I was surprised by what I heard. She didn't sound like the golden child I had grown up resenting. She sounded tired, uncertain. I didn't ask them to call you about money, she said quietly. I just wanted you at my wedding. I know we haven't been close. I know things have been weird, but you're still my sister. There was a pause, and then she asked me something I never expected. Do you ever feel like they're planning your whole life without asking what you want? For a moment, I saw her differently. Not the spoiled princess who had gotten everything I was denied, but a woman who had never been allowed to develop her own identity. A woman being steered into a strategic marriage to elevate the family's social standing. Bradley is fine, she continued. He's fine, but sometimes I don't know if I'm marrying him or marrying the life Mom and Dad want for me. Does that make sense? It did. More than she knew. For a brief moment, I felt something I hadn't felt toward Lily in years. Sympathy, understanding, maybe even connection. But then she added, if you could help with the money, though it would make things easier. You know how they get when things aren't perfect. And just like that, the moment was gone. Even in her vulnerability, she expected my sacrifice. Some patterns run generations deep. Against Marcus's advice, I agreed to attend the family dinner. I told myself I just wanted to hear them out to understand what they really needed. I told myself I was strong enough now to say no if I needed to. I was fooling myself. When I arrived at my parents' house, everything looked the same as it always had. The same formal living room, the same family photos on the wall that somehow included very few of me. The same dining table where I had eaten countless meals in silence while Lily chattered about her day. But this time I noticed something new. A folder sitting on the table. Thick, official looking. My father steered the conversation away from it, at first focusing on wedding plans. How wonderful the Harrisons were. How this marriage would elevate the whole family. How proud they were of Lily. Finally, after dinner, he slid the folder toward me. Just some financial paperwork, he said casually. We're restructuring some family assets, and as the eldest daughter, we need your signature on a few things. I opened the folder. My blood went cold. It was an application for a home equity line of credit. On my house, $150,000. I would be the sole borrower. The family would use the money for various expenses. My name, my house, my debt. It's just a formality, my mother said smoothly, leaning forward with that familiar smile. We'll handle the payments. You won't even notice. Think of it as helping the whole family move forward together. My father's hand was on my shoulder. The pen was already uncapped and waiting on the table. Every instinct in my body screamed danger. This was wrong. This was a trap. But my mother was looking at me with that familiar expression, the one that mixed expectation with implied threat. The one that said refusing would prove I was exactly as ungrateful as they always suspected. My hand trembled as I reached for the pen. The doorbell rang. Everyone froze. My father's face went white. Through the window, I saw a face I barely recognized. Margaret. She looked gaunt and ill thinner than when I had last seen her, but her eyes were fierce, determined. She was clutching a large envelope against her chest like it contained something precious. Don't answer that, my father said sharply. There was fear in his voice, real fear, but I was already standing. Something in my gut told me that whoever was on the other side of that door had the answers to questions I'd been afraid to ask my whole life. My mother grabbed my arm. Taryn, sit down. That woman is not welcome in this house. I pulled free, and I walked to the door. I opened the door, and Margaret nearly collapsed into my arms. She was thinner than the last time I had seen her, her skin pale and drawn tight against her bones. But her eyes burned with a fierce determination that seemed to be holding her fragile body together by sheer force of will. She clutched a large manila envelope against her chest like it was the most precious thing she owned. I'm sorry to come like this, she said, her voice hoarse but steady. But I saw your car in the driveway, and I know what they're trying to do to you tonight. Before I could respond, my father appeared behind me. His voice was cold in a way I had never heard before. Margaret, you need to leave. Now. We had an agreement. Margaret didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes locked on mine. The agreement was that I would stay quiet as long as they treated you fairly. They never did. And now they're trying to put you $150,000 in debt for a wedding that should have been paid for with your own money 30 years ago. My mother's voice cut through from the dining room sharp as broken glass. You're dying and delusional. Get out of my house before I call the police. But Margaret ignored her too. She pressed the envelope into my hands. Your whole life you were told you were a stranger they chose to love. That was a lie. Everything in here will explain everything. Please, Taryn, read it before you sign anything. My father lunged forward, trying to grab the envelope from my hands. I stepped back instinctively, holding it against my chest the same way Margaret had. I'll read it in my car, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Alone, then I'll come back inside and we can discuss whatever needs to be discussed. I walked past my father before he could stop me. I walked past my mother, who stood frozen in the hallway with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Fear, real undisguised fear. I walked out into the cool night air and climbed into my car and locked the doors behind me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely open the envelope. Inside, I found a stack of documents that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life. The first item was a birth certificate, my birth certificate. But it was different from the one I had seen before. Under the line for mother's name, it didn't say unknown or sealed. It said Eleanor Marie O'Brien. I stared at that name for a long time. Eleanor, the name I had overheard my father say on the phone when I was a teenager. The name I had searched for, uselessly not knowing anything else about her. Now I had a full name, and somehow I knew that everything was about to change. The next item was a photograph. The moment I saw it, my breath stopped. It was the same woman from the attic. The photograph my mother had snatched from my hands when I was 14 and told me was no one. But she wasn't no one. She had my exact eyes, my exact smile. She was holding a baby in her arms, looking down with an expression of pure love. I turned the photo over. Written on the back in faded ink were the words Eleanor and Taryn 1990. Next was a newspaper clipping from 1992. The headline read, "Local woman dies in highway accident, leaves behind 2-year-old daughter." The article described how Eleanor O'Brien, aged 32, had been killed by a drunk driver on the Pacific Coast Highway. She was survived by her daughter Taryn, aged 2, and her 2 younger sisters, Diane and Margaret. I read that line 3 times. Her 2 younger sisters, Diane and Margaret. Diane, my mother. The woman who had raised me, who had told me I was adopted from an agency who had made me feel like a burden my entire life. She wasn't my adoptive mother, she was my aunt. And Margaret wasn't some distant relative who had appeared from nowhere. She was my aunt too, my mother's sister, my real mother's sister. The next document was a copy of a will dated 1991, Eleanor's will. It was written in legal language, but the meaning was clear. Eleanor had left everything she owned to her daughter Taryn to be held in trust until my 18th birthday. Her house in San Diego, her savings accounts, her investment portfolio, all of it. Approximately $300,000 in total. The will named Diane and Richard McCarthy as guardians and trustees responsible for raising me and protecting my inheritance until I came of age. I flipped to the next documents. Property records showing that Eleanor's house had been sold in 1993. Bank statements showing systematic withdrawals from a trust account over several years until there was nothing left. They had taken everything, every penny my mother had left me. They had stolen my inheritance and then told me I was adopted from an agency, so I would never think to look for answers. They had erased my mother from existence and raised me to be grateful for scraps while spending my money on themselves and their biological daughter. The last item in the envelope was a handwritten letter from Margaret. My hands trembled as I read it. Taryn, Eleanor was my older sister. She was also Diane's older sister. We were 3 girls from the same family. Eleanor was the golden one, smart, successful kind. Diane was always jealous of her even when we were children. When Eleanor died, her will named Diane and Richard as your guardians and trustees. They were supposed to raise you with love and protect your inheritance until you turned 18. Instead, they stole everything. They told you that you were adopted from an agency so you would never look for answers. They cut me out of your life because I knew the truth. I kept silent for decades because they threatened me. They said they would tell you I was crazy, that I was lying, that I was trying to steal you away from your real family. I was young and scared. I moved across the country and tried to forget. But when I got sick, I knew I couldn't die with this secret. Your mother loved you more than anything in this world. She would have given you everything. They took that everything and spent it on themselves. I'm sorry it took me so long to find my courage. Please forgive me. I sat in my car for an hour. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I felt strangely calm. The kind of calm that comes when your entire foundation has just crumbled into dust and you're still waiting for gravity to notice. Every strange moment of my childhood suddenly made sense. The favoritism toward Lily wasn't about me being adopted. It was about me being a living reminder of the sister Diane had always resented. The lack of investment in me wasn't about limited resources. They had $300,000 of my money to spend. The secrets, the deflections, the photographs snatched from my hands, all of it was to hide the mother they had erased. A tap on my window made me jump. Margaret stood outside looking worried. I rolled down the window. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know this is too much. I should have told you years ago." I looked at her, this frail, dying woman who had carried this burden for 3 decades. "How long do you have?" 4 months, maybe 6. The doctors aren't optimistic. "Is everything in here real? Can it be verified?" She nodded. "The will is on file with the probate court in San Diego County. The property records are public. The bank statements came from Eleanor's files, which I've kept in a storage unit for 30 years. It's all real, Taryn. Every word." I looked back at the house. Through the window, I could see my parents watching us, the people I had spent 35 years calling mom and dad. They were waiting for me to come back inside and sign papers that would put me in debt, papers that would let them steal from me again. I started my car. I'm not going back in there tonight. I need time. I need to verify everything. I need to talk to a lawyer. And then I'm going to make sure they answer for what they did. Not with screaming, not with drama, with the truth. Margaret squeezed my hand through the window. Your mother would be so proud. This time I understood exactly who she meant. I drove away without looking back. My phone buzzed with 17 missed calls before I finally turned it off. The next 2 weeks would be the longest of my life. But when I was ready, I would face them with the truth in my hands. The next 2 weeks were the longest of my life. I didn't sleep more than a few hours each night. But I worked. Every single day, I worked to verify every word Margaret had told me. I hired an estate attorney named Patricia Wellman, a sharp woman in her 60s who had handled hundreds of trust fraud cases. When I showed her the documents, she didn't flinch. She had seen this before. Families destroying each other over money. Trustees betraying the children they were supposed to protect. She told me the facts in plain language. The will was valid. The trust was legally binding. And fraud by a trustee has no statute of limitations when it has been actively concealed. My parents had not simply neglected to tell me about my inheritance. They had lied directly repeatedly for 33 years. They had told me I was adopted from an agency. They had destroyed photographs. They had cut off the one person who knew the truth. That wasn't negligence. That was deliberate, calculated fraud. I traveled to San Diego and obtained certified copies of every document from the county probate court. Eleanor's will with the official court seal, property records showing her house had been sold in 1993, bank records showing a trust account systematically drained over 5 years. I hired a forensic accountant to calculate what I was owed. With interest and inflation adjustments, the total estimated value was over $650,000. My lawyer drafted a formal demand letter, but before sending it, she asked me a question. Do you want to confront them personally first? Some clients want that closure. Others prefer to let the legal process speak for itself. I thought about it for a long time. Part of me wanted to never see their faces again. But a larger part needed something else. I needed them to know that I knew. I needed to watch their carefully constructed lies crumble in front of witnesses. I want witnesses, I told her. I want to do this in front of people whose opinion they actually care about. I requested a meeting with my parents, but they refused to see me alone. They were too busy with wedding preparations, they said. Fine. If they wouldn't meet me privately, I would come to them publicly. Lily's rehearsal dinner was scheduled for that Friday evening, an intimate gathering at an upscale restaurant with both families present. The Harrisons would be there. The people my parents were so desperate to impress. Perfect. I texted Lily that I would be attending. She responded almost immediately. Are you going to help with the money Mom and Dad are stressed? I didn't answer. Instead, I prepared. I assembled a folder containing copies of every document, every receipt, every piece of evidence. Certified copies with court stamps and official seals. Documents that could not be dismissed as fabrications. I practiced what I would say. No screaming, no crying, no emotional outbursts that would let them paint me as unstable. Just questions asked calmly, in front of people whose good opinion my parents valued more than they had ever valued me. Marcus drove me to the restaurant that evening. He offered to come inside, but I told him to wait in the car. This was something I needed to do alone. He squeezed my hand and told me he would be right there when I was finished. The rehearsal dinner was elegant. White tablecloths, expensive wine, fresh flowers on every table. The Harrison family looked polished and expectant. My parents were in full performance mode, laughing and charming, and playing the role of the proud, loving family. When I walked in, my mother's smile flickered with uncertainty. Taryn, we haven't heard from you in 2 weeks. We were worried. I took my seat calmly, placing my folder on the table. I've been doing some research, I said, about my adoption. The silence was immediate. My father's fork paused halfway to his mouth. My mother's eyes darted to the folder, then back to my face. I found my birth certificate, I continued. The real one. Eleanor O'Brien is listed as my mother. I watched the color drain from their face. Bradley Harrison Sr. looked up with polite curiosity. Who is Eleanor O'Brien? I turned to face him. She was my mother, my biological mother, and she was Diane's older sister. The sister whose existence was erased from this family. The sister who left me $300,000 in a trust that was stolen before I was old enough to know it existed. My mother laughed nervously. Taryn, sweetheart, someone is clearly filling your head with lies. I opened my folder. San Diego County Probate Court, I said, sliding the first document across the table. Eleanor O'Brien's last will and testament dated 1991. I slid another document. Property sale records from 1993. Another document. Bank records showing systematic withdrawal of trust funds. I looked around the table. Would you like to examine the documents, or should I pass them around? The performance crumbled in stages. My mother tried denial. Those are fabricated. That Margaret woman has been trying to destroy this family for years. But the documents had court stamps, official seals, certified copies that could be verified with a single phone call. My father tried deflection. This is neither the time nor the place. We should talk privately. But Bradley Harrison Sr. was already examining the documents with the trained eye of a corporate lawyer. His expression grew increasingly grim with each page. Lily stared at our parents with dawning horror. Is this true? Eleanor was... You never told me we had another aunt. It was my mother who finally cracked. Not with remorse, with rage, pure, unfiltered rage. Do you know what it was like? She screamed, rising from her chair. My perfect sister dead at 32, and everyone expected me to raise her daughter like some saint. We deserved that money for taking you in. We gave up our lives for you. We sacrificed everything. The table went silent. Every word was a confession. Bradley Sr. quietly pulled his son aside. Within 20 minutes, the Harrison family had made polite excuses and left. The engagement was formally ended the following week. My father sat with his head in his hands, not speaking. I stood and collected my documents. You'll be receiving a letter from my attorney tomorrow. I'm pursuing full recovery of the stolen assets, plus interest. Given that you actively concealed the fraud for over 3 decades, there is no statute of limitations. My lawyer estimates you owe approximately $650,000. I turned to leave. My mother screamed after me. You're destroying this family, after everything we did for you. I paused at the door without turning around. You didn't do anything for me. You did everything to me. There's a difference. I walked out into the cool evening air and found Marcus waiting by the car. He didn't say anything. He just wrapped his arms around me and held me while I finally let myself shake. It was over, or rather, it was just beginning. The legal battle would take months, but for the first time in my life, I was fighting with the truth on my side. The legal battle that followed was grueling, but the outcome was never really in doubt. My parents hired a lawyer who initially tried to argue that the money they took was fair compensation for raising me. Their lawyer claimed that 33 years of food, clothing, and shelter justified the complete draining of my inheritance. But my attorney dismantled that argument in a single meeting. Trustees have a legal obligation to protect assets, not consume them. And the fact that they had actively lied about my origins, destroyed evidence, and continued the deception for over 3 decades made this clear-cut fraud. Their lawyer advised them to settle. A court case would mean public records, newspaper coverage, potential criminal referral. Richard and Diane had spent their entire lives building an image of respectability. They couldn't survive having their crimes exposed in open court. 6 months after my demand letter, they agreed to settle. The terms were straightforward. They sold the house that had been purchased with my mother's money 33 years ago. They liquidated most of their remaining assets. After paying off their existing debts and legal fees, I received $340,000. It was less than the inflation-adjusted total I was owed, but it was more than I ever expected to actually recover. And watching them sign over the proceeds from selling the home they had built on my stolen inheritance was satisfaction enough. Richard and Diane moved into a small rental apartment on the other side of Columbus. No more dinner parties, no more performances of affluence for the neighbors. The people who had admired them for decades now whispered about that fraud situation with their daughter. Their reputation, the thing they had valued above all else, was destroyed. Some might say losing their home and their standing was punishment enough. I would say it was the bare minimum of what they deserved. Margaret never saw the settlement finalized. She died 3 months after the rehearsal dinner confrontation, while the lawyers were still negotiating terms. I was with her at the end. In her final weeks, she gave me something more valuable than any amount of money. She gave me my mother, Every day that she had the strength to talk, Margaret told me stories about Eleanor. How she laughed with her whole body. How she was brilliant at her job, but couldn't cook to save her life. How she used to sing off key while driving. How she had cried with joy when she found out she was pregnant with me. She used to say you were the best thing she ever did. Margaret told me, her voice barely above a whisper. She had such plans for you. She would have moved mountains to give you everything. Margaret had kept a box hidden for 30 years. Inside were photographs she had saved from being destroyed. Eleanor holding me as a baby, both of us laughing at something off camera. Eleanor at her college graduation, young and full of hope. Eleanor on her wedding day, radiant in white. A mother I had never known, preserved in faded photographs. I should have been braver, Margaret said near the end. I should have told you sooner. I wasted so many years being afraid. I held her hand and told her the truth. You told me when you could. You saved me from signing away my house. You gave me my mother back. That's enough, Margaret. That's more than enough. She smiled at me, and for a moment I saw something of Eleanor in her face. You really are her daughter, she said. Strong, brave, unwilling to accept less than you deserve. She died the next morning peacefully with my hand in hers. I like to think she went to find her sister to tell her that the mission was finally complete. My parents cycled through responses in the months after the settlement. First came anger. Richard left a voicemail calling me a thief, saying I had taken everything from them. The irony was apparently lost on him. Then came self-pity. Diane sent letters describing how hard their lives were, now how they were old and struggling. How could I do this to my own parents? Finally came manipulation disguised as reconciliation. They wrote asking if we could start over, if we could put the past behind us, if we could be a family again. My response was the same every time. I told them they could contact me by letter only. I would not accept phone calls or visits. If they wanted any relationship with me, it would begin with a full written acknowledgement of what they had done and a genuine apology. Not an apology for getting caught, an apology for the action itself, for stealing from me, for erasing my mother, for lying to me every single day of my life. They never wrote that letter. I didn't expect them to. Some people cannot admit what they have done, even when they have lost everything. Their pride is worth more to them than any relationship. Lily's path was different. The Harrison engagement ended within a week of the rehearsal dinner. Bradley's family wanted no association with a fraud scandal. Lily was devastated at first, but something in her began to shift. 18 months after everything collapsed, I received a letter from her. It wasn't asking for money. It wasn't making excuses for our parents. It was simply an acknowledgement. I didn't know, she wrote, but I should have noticed how they treated you. I was so focused on what I was getting that I never asked why you weren't getting the same. I'm sorry. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just needed you to know that I see it now. I didn't respond immediately, but I didn't throw the letter away either. Some doors can stay open a crack. Time would tell if Lily was truly changing or just performing regret. A year after the settlement was finalized, I flew to San Diego. I found my mother's grave in a small cemetery overlooking the Pacific Ocean. The headstone read, Eleanor Marie O'Brien, beloved mother, 1962 and 1992. Someone had kept fresh flowers there for 30 years. Margaret, I realized. Even from 2,000 miles away, she had made sure her sister was never forgotten. I sat by the grave for a long time. I told Eleanor about my life. About Marcus, who loved me without condition, about the career I had built with no help from anyone, about finally learning the truth. I wish I remembered you, I said. I was only 2 when you died. I don't have any memories. But Margaret told me stories, and now I have your pictures, and I know that I was loved. That's more than I had before. I placed fresh flowers next to the weathered ones and made a silent promise to return every year. I'm going to be okay, Mom. I have a family now, the one I built myself, and I finally know where I came from. That's enough. That's more than enough. On the flight home, Marcus asked me how I felt. I thought about it for a long time before answering. Free, I finally said. I feel free. At 36, I finally learned the truth about who I was. I lost the parents who raised me, but they were never really mine. I lost the Bastien who saved me, but she left me the greatest gift. My mother's memory restored. I gained $340,000, but the money was never really the point. What I gained was permission. Permission to stop performing gratitude I didn't owe. Permission to stop earning love that should have been freely given. Permission to be Eleanor's daughter, not Richard and Diane's burden. Some people will tell you that family means accepting anything, forgiving everything, sacrificing yourself on the altar of blood relations. I used to believe that. I spent 35 years believing it. Now I know better. Family is not an obligation. Family is a choice. And I choose the people who choose me back. If you're still waiting for people to love you the way you deserve, I hope you find your truth. I hope you find your Margaret. And I hope you find the strength to walk away from tables where love was always conditional and build your own. Taryn's story reminds us of a truth that many of us learned too late. The people who are supposed to love us unconditionally sometimes come with the heaviest conditions of all. If you grew up feeling like you had to earn your place at the family table, if you were always the one expected to sacrifice, while others received freely, if you have ever wondered why your best was never good enough, know this. It was never about you. It was always about them. You cannot pour from an empty cup, and you cannot build a life on a foundation of lies. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is stop accepting crumbs from people who owe us the whole meal. Sometimes walking away is not giving up. It is finally choosing yourself. Real family is not determined by blood or legal documents. Real family is built on mutual respect, honesty, and love that does not come with strings attached. You deserve that kind of family. We all do. Thank you for listening to Taryn's story today. If her journey touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story. Leave a comment below and tell us, have you ever discovered a family secret that changed everything? We would love to hear from you.